I first became interested in the story of George Hubert Wilkins when a friend of mine suggested more than 3 years ago now that I read the book about him by Simon Nash. Like many others, ever since I've become obsessed with the man, particularly by the fact that until then none had attempted to bring his photos and films together. That has now been done through my documentary The Eye of Wilkins and now the pictorial photo book of the same name. So what's all the fuss about? So let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is in country like this, near Mount Bryan, east of Hallett, in our mid-north, but on the wrong side of the Goyder line. And he's born into this cottage, Netfield, which now restored you can visit. His parents are these, Eloisa and Harry, with his mother already in her 50s when George Hubert is born as her 13th child. After they get cleaned out by the Federation drought, they come to Adelaide, from where the young Burke quickly escapes to Sydney and gets a job as a projectionist at the new cinemas before somehow he gets to London in 1912, aged 24, and gets a job with the Government Media Company. For their newsreels, they send him up in a balloon with this idiot for a Christmas confectionery stunt, and he finishes up being blown out over the channel and is lucky to make his way back alive. They also send him to the new Brooklands racing track to film Percy Lambert's attempt to become the first man to travel 100 miles in an hour. This is the oldest surviving film of Wilkins's, and to Trinidad to film Food for the Gods, a promotional piece for Cadbury chocolates. Then, in 1913, they sent him to cover the First Balkan War between the Bulgars and the Turks. Wilkins is on the extreme left holding his camera before boarding a train to the battlefields. At this point in the history of journalism, carrying a camera makes him the lowest form of life. Later that year, he gets sent by governments on the Canadian Arctic Expedition, a proposed 4-year project to explore both geographically and scientifically what lay beyond the most northern spots of North America. From what is still preserved, we quickly see what a good eye Wilkins has for both composition and subject matter. His work with sailing boats and their riggings become one of the features of the collection over time. In 1915, in the freezing cold, there aren't too many books to read or tutorials to watch of how to take great images, but Burt Wilkins seems to instinctively know how. The expedition itself is a debacle, however. One of the exploring boats gets lost in the ice and half the crew die by the end of the first winter. By good fortune, Wilkins survives and befriends the locals who have much to teach him. His best mate is the guy on the extreme left here, Billy Nat Kusiak. Together he goes on to capture relaxed and respectful images of the locals as they go about their normal life and the landscape, including a series on steps to building an igloo from which this image is one. His masterwork, I believe, is an extensive series of stunning portraits taken over his 3 years involved of the Inuits, or Eskimos as they were then known. It was probably the first time such photographs were taken, and they deserve much greater recognition than they have received. Dartmouth University is the keeper of these. By the end of the summer of 1916, Wilkins has lost faith in the leader of the expedition, and with the news of the death of his father, manages a graceful exit from the Arctic and his way back to civilization. But it is not for long. Having been at Gallipoli, in 1917, war historian Charles Bean appointed our Captain George Wilkins as one of his first 2 battlefront photographers, the other Frank Hurley. This is the type of camera they used, not terribly discreet, but very heavy and cumbersome, and one that required plates which were carried by assistants. But quickly Wilkins started taking some of the images that remain as the most notable from that conflict, even today more than 100 years on. No country had ever taken photos like this, and it had taken Bean 2 years to convince the brass in London to allow it to happen. Bean wanted to record every aspect of the war, the battles, the bombs, the bodies. Wilkins went about his task embedded amongst our troops at the front lines and behind them, recording all their names. These images were, as Bean required them, of the soldiers. They were what they were all about. This is one of the most famous, soldiers recording their votes in the second conscription referendum of 1917, one that was also defeated mainly on the votes of the soldiers themselves. He travelled with our diggers to the front, mastering an ability as here to capture a photo at just the right time. He recorded what mess was left after a fight, the dead of both sides and the living lying together, almost indistinguishable, before mixing again as here with the troops when they had recovered in one of the many really terrific team photos Wilkins took across the years. So much to look at and notice in the young faces in their varied uniforms. In his films, Wilkins records what he sees without flourish, just the facts as they are. Here a digger is dying, that he is being attended to by the chaplain on the left, as well as the medic, and behind his mates stand and watch. All but the soldier accept the inevitable, but they are not going to let him die alone. But even as abysmal it all must have been, Wilkins still found time to record an image like this, full of irony and humour. In 1921 he gets a gig on board Sir Ernest Shackleton's new expedition to Antarctica aboard the Quest. Wilkins holds Shackleton in the highest regard, and this is the culmination of a long-held dream to be a part of one of the great man's voyages. Here Shackleton is on the left with the ship's captain Frank Wild on the right, and medic and fellow cameraman and Australian Arthur Macklin. From photographs donated by Macklin's family to the State Library of New South Wales, Wilkins has left behind some very fine sailing boat images, recording life on board, incorporating their riggings, and in this next image, what becomes almost a trademark of his, capturing the visual attention of only one participant in the image. Here, the gentleman second on the right for just that precise moment of its taking. No sooner than the Quest reaches the lowest tip of South America than Shackleton dies on board of heart failure, a condition he almost certainly knew about before he set off from London. But Wilkins continues on for what became almost a home away from home for the next 15 years. He takes some magnificent landscapes of the snow and ice and of the whaling towns that prospered there. Many of these images come from our own state library in North Terrace, which happen, perhaps strangely, to be the only Wilkins images they carry. As he was appointed Shackleton's biologist, a role for which he had no qualifications, not that that seemed to bother either him or his boss, he also shoots some terrific naturalist film. Sadly, time does not exist to cover all of the adventures of Wilkins. Indeed, we would need a week to do that. But in the time available, let me cover quickly two from the 1920s. In 1923, the British Museum appointed Wilkins to survey fauna and flora in northern Australia before any more was lost to farming. It was meant to be a 2-year mission that started near Townsville and went around to Arnhem Land. On it, Wilkins and his team collected specimens and took many photographs, including of this extraordinary fossil. He also took many images of the locals with whom he felt at home, as he had grown up with Aborigines in our mid-north, and recorded it all in a book, Undiscovered Australia, a somewhat curious title for a land that was then well populated and serviced by white men. However, the criticism he levelled in his reports and in that book at Australian farmers and the country in general came back at him in spades, and this was probably the least successful of all his expeditions, and many suspect it is a major reason why Wilkins has never received the accolades he might have in his home country. Having struck a close working relationship with the media magnate William Randolph Hearst, Wilkins got the gig to report on and photograph the round-the-world flight of the Graf Zeppelin in 1929. Wilkins' photography targets three things, two being the sheer size and majesty of the flying machine and the wonders it produced both in the air and on the ground, especially when it landed in Tokyo. To be sure, the Zeppelin was huge, 3 times the size of the Goodyear blimps we may see over US sporting events nowadays. The purpose of the trip was to beat the then record for flying around the world. But no expense was spared, as recorded in the final focus of Wilkins's camera, the luxury enjoyed within its confines, which included silver service with waiting staff and, of course, travelling musicians. In 1929 there was a race on to be the first person to reach the North Pole. All the great explorers and media companies of the time wanted in. Wilkins was a part of the action, though he was more keen on flying not to the pole but over it. By various means he came across this man, Ben Eielson, an introspective pilot from Wyoming who was already a legend in northern Canada and Alaska as the man who carried the mail, supplies and muckshells. Through the car makers in Detroit he secured 2 planes, and within 24 hours they had crashed them both. Broken but not beaten, one afternoon he spotted a new sort of plane flying across the skies, the Vega. He tracked down the makers, the then new Lockheed Company in Los Angeles, and ordered one, a plane he called his Bird of Paradise. The association with Lockheed was mutually beneficial, especially as they also provided the aircraft for Amelia Earhart, seen here on the left in one of the most popular photos in the Wilkins collection. So off they went, landing first here in Point Barrow, Alaska, where, notwithstanding the blizzard conditions, their arrival produced unbridled excitement and delight for the young locals. Having never seen a plane before, they asked, "How can it fly? It has no feathers." When the weather cleared in mid-April 1929, they took off to traverse 3,500 kilometres, crossing 10 time zones in a flight that would take 22 hours and leave them with no gas to spare if problems arose. All the calculations required to keep direction and adjust for the Earth's magnetic fields at its strongest at the poles were to be done by Wilkins alone by hand. The great Norwegian explorer of the time, Roald Amundsen, said it couldn't be done, and most others agreed. But get it done they did, a feat that rivaled anything else aeronautical before or after, until maybe Yuri Gagarin made it into space nearly 30 years later. Wilkins was knighted as an aviator, and together they were lauded around the world, here in Detroit, in London, Berlin and New York. Sadly, on a routine flight back home after, Ben Eielson crashed his plane into a mountain and was killed. In truth, in the history of aviation, few others could ever be considered in the same breath as these two. Having flown over both polar regions, in 1931 Wilkins attempts to take this beaten-up old Great War submarine to under the North Pole. The mission, for the most part, is a debacle. During better times, he takes a range of photographs of conditions and the men aboard the ship, which he has renamed the Nautilus in honour of Jules Verne's vessel of the same name. He has men looking out, looking down, looking closely while removing a tooth, and then of him as he records his daily update for the Hearst media that is sponsoring the expedition. As the voyage proceeds, things become as frosty with his sponsor as they are outside. The trip starts to great fanfare in New York, nearly ends in catastrophe in the North Atlantic, but resumes after getting hauled to the Irish coast by the US Coast Guard, and finally gets to Spitsbergen, Norway, really all too late in the season to attempt an assault on the pole. Despite all the problems, Wilkins keeps taking images that make his world seem quite serene, if not surreal. In the end, he abandons his goal of reaching under the North Pole, at which point Hearst abandons him. But again, perhaps foolhardily, he decides to plough on, putting at risk the lives of 22 crew and scientists, a situation made worse when he finds the diving rudders have dropped off, almost certainly the result of sabotage by a member of his own crew. But on he goes to record these extraordinary images, the first time any person had seen such things, what lay beneath the polar ice cap, thus determining whether navigation there was possible. It was a revelation that endeared Sir Hubert to the US Navy for the rest of his life. One of the things that has come out of putting together this book and the associated documentary about Sir Hubert Wilkins is that not only is there no Wilkins story that he hadn't carried a camera, but that he was a very fine photographer in his own right and deserves recognition for that. While photography and filmmaking existed from the mid-19th century, it wasn't until the 1930s, 40s and 50s that photography first came to be considered an art, that there was an inspiration and brilliance that went into the work of its finest exponents. This movement was driven mostly, but certainly not only, by American photographers of the likes of Edward Weston, Paul Strand, Henri Cartier-Bresson and Ansel Adams. Together they formed Magnum Photographers, the first and still the preeminent photography society. Each of its members came to be regarded for certain types of images, their trademarks, which came to be recognised the world over, copied, and as style advanced upon. Many were of the sorts of people and places that middle-class city and suburban living Americans had never seen before. But as noted earlier, when Wilkins was out and about doing his best work prior to the start of this art as photography movement, there were no books to guide him, and yet his work contains the insights and perspective that these others made famous, allegedly as their own. Consider when Paul Strand took this captivating image in France, Hubert Wilkins had taken this nearly 40 years before. When Wilkins took this in World War I of soldiers having been gassed, Strand didn't take this till well after World War II. Ansel Adams went to Wyoming in 1942 to take this famous vista, while Wilkins already had this from Antarctica from 20 years before. Cartier-Bresson took his decisive moment at this punter's leap at the Gare du Nord just before the Second World War, while in 1923 Wilkins closed his shutter at the precise moment this young Aboriginal man's spear hits the water, with him about to follow it in. Finally, Edward Weston, also in the late 1930s, captures this barren landscape, while Wilkins, with Eilson in the foreground, executes on this a decade before. To bookend our start, Wilkins dies of natural causes in a hotel room in this town, Framingham, Massachusetts, in late 1959, soon after his 70th birthday. This is likely the last film he took, possibly from on that fateful trip. But his life story does not really end until the USS Skate takes his ashes to be spread at the North Pole in this ceremony a few months into 1960. Thankfully, his story and his photography live on.